Hello there. Welcome to the podcast Sensory Ideas for Home. My name's Claire Stoland. I am an occupational therapist and a qualified sensory integration therapist. And what we really want to do today is to introduce you to a bit more of a toolbox of ideas for things that can support anyone that you support or live with who has sensory issues. We all know that at this time it can be more difficult for those people to engage in activities that will support their well-being and balance out their sensory need. And so today we're going to talk through different ideas to do that are a little easier to introduce in the immediate vicinity of your home and are more accessible at the moment. In doing that, what I'd really like everyone to keep in mind is that when we're offering people options from this toolkit, I need you to do is make sure that any health needs are considered and any risk needs are considered in that, to make sure that offering them these opportunities are safe. Okay. Okay, so really briefly today, what I'm going to talk about is I'm going to talk us through the senses, just so that I can explain why we're going to suggest some of the ideas that I have. And therefore, when we're talking about senses, I know that the majority of people know that we have sight, sound, smell, taste, and touch. And those are all incredibly important to understanding the world around us. In fact, our senses are our only window to the world, and therefore developmentally are the only way that we know the world exists and what we can use our body for in the world. So each of those are very important, but alongside those five, we also have the proprioceptive system and the vestibular system. The proprioceptive system, albeit sounding really grand, is just the information that comes in through our muscles and our joints that allows us to understand where our body is in space without us having to look. So right now, I have my legs crossed and I haven't had to look to place one leg over the other. I know that my legs are crossed because of the pressure coming back in through my calf, my thigh, and through into my bottom that tells me that I'm grounded, I'm safe, and I'm sat on the seat securely. That all comes from my proprioceptive system. My proprioceptive system is based in pull, push, pressure, and force because that's how our muscles work, through contraction, bunching up, release, contraction, release. And therefore, the way that we detect proprioception, our understanding of where our body is in space, comes from pull, push, pressure, and force. You may have heard of examples of proprioception before, such as deep pressure or using weighted items, and those all are rooted in proprioception, and I'll explain why as we go along. The vestibular system is a system that sits in our inner ear, and again it sounds really fancy, but actually is just the system that helps us to understand movement, heights, and gravity. It helps us to work out which way's up and which way's down. When we struggle with our vestibular system, people without a sensory issue may experience vertigo as a result. So you can imagine if your vestibular system isn't working very well, that it can be incredibly disorientating, and actually is known as a system that can create a whole lot of anxiety. Because each of our sensory systems works by producing a level of adrenaline, and that adrenaline tells us, do we need to be alert to something in our environment, or can we ignore it? So on a morning when I wake up, when I'm still asleep, and my husband switches on the light, do I know that I can ignore it because I don't really need to be up this morning? Or do I need to alert to it because actually something's wrong and I need to respond? What happens is, as that light's detected in my brain, I produce a small amount of adrenaline, which will bring me into consciousness. And I can then decide, oh, what's the threat level here? No, I don't need to know it. Therefore, I can absorb all of that adrenaline back into my body and not worry about it and go off to sleep again. Where we come across threats in our environment, so our sensory systems tell us that something is wrong. So for example, if a lion walked in this room right now, I would get a huge kick of adrenaline that would put me into a state of fight or flight, into a state of survival, and that would be driven by the high level of adrenaline that would be flowing through my body, and that's produced as a result of my sensory systems. Now, what happens is when we have a sensory issue, a developmental sensory issue, we produce the wrong amount of adrenaline for the information coming in, and therefore we will ignore things that we really need to pay attention to and appear completely unaware of them. And equally, we will have a massive fight or flight adrenaline fueled reaction to something that somebody else doesn't even notice. So for example, I have a clock next to me right now. The ticking of the clock may well cause an adrenaline fueled fight or flight reaction for some people. And that would mean that they would feel the need to run, to fight, to become aggressive, to survive that experience in just the same way that I would if a lion walked in. And what we need to do when we have somebody who has a sensory issue is look at the way that they're responding to establish, are they experiencing a fight or flight reaction that means that we need to do something to reduce the adrenaline in their system. And the ideas that we're going to talk about today are going to give you options to calm down that adrenaline response, or indeed give them a little bit more adrenaline through their senses to keep them alert and keep them functioning. The reason that we know that this is an issue is that people with sensory issues tend to respond differently to the majority of people given the same circumstance. Now, that isn't a problem in itself. It's when people are responding with behaviours and responses that cause a problem for them, pose a risk to them, pose a risk to somebody else, or cause a problem for somebody else that we can't work around in any other way. And that's when we need some of these sensory strategies to support them in their environment so that they can continue to function as well as they can and achieve well-being more than anything else. So for most people, when we're talking about sensory issues, people know that we are talking about people who will seek or avoid sensory information. To keep it nice and simple, I tend to talk about people being oversensitive to some sensory information and undersensitive to others. So for each of those sensations, we can have somebody who feels some information so much more acutely than the rest of us. So they feel it so much more. So the sound of a clock ticking can sound like the roar of that lion and therefore make them feel very threatened by it. And nobody else would be aware of it because to everybody else, it's a background noise that doesn't cause a problem and therefore they wouldn't even register it. But for that person, all they know all of a sudden is that they feel very overwhelmed and unsafe. And that's why they often begin to react with a more increased agitation or discomfort, aggression, or even violence. And possibly the most distressing is when they're violent towards themselves. But it doesn't always have to be as extreme as that for us to notice it and try and work out what we need to do. People who are undersensitive to some sensory information will seek more of that sensation until they have enough that they can register it. So for example, if I am somebody who needs a lot more movement information, I will run and jump and climb until I get enough of that information to feel alert and okay and alive. And that means that sometimes I will do that at all costs, regardless of the risk to me or to other people. And that's when that causes us a problem too. And we need then to calm that reaction down. Now, the difficulty that we have in most sensory issues is that people are never just oversensitive or undersensitive to all of those sensations, or even to one of them. People tend to be sometimes oversensitive and sometimes undersensitive. And that's really important to keep in mind because it can be very confusing from our point of view. Why one day something can be really uncomfortable to someone so that they pose an aggressive response, and yet the next day they don't even notice it. But when you look at the neurology of what's happening with sensory issues, because that's what we're talking about how this information is used in the brain. And in people with sensory issues, they use that information differently, less efficiently, in a less mature way than most people. And therefore, their response will be different. So what happens is that at some times of day, I can cope with some sensory information better than I can cope with it at others. And that's perfectly normal for all of us. Some of us can quite happily deal with a full-on rave at 7 o'clock at night, but not so many of us can cope with it at 7 o'clock in the morning. And that's totally normal because there's different levels of input that you can cope with at different points of the day. And it really all depends on what your sensory systems have done before that, how much adrenaline they've experienced, how tired they are from experiencing that. And it also depends on their natural level that they're happy with in the first place, what they're sensitive to and what they're not. So when we're thinking about these sensory issues and what we need to do, that's what we need to be thinking about. When we think back to those sensory systems and we think back to that proprioceptive system, so remember proprioception is the information that comes through from your muscles and your joints, little receptors in your muscles and your joints that feeds back to your brain continuously to tell you where you are in space. It deals in pull, push, pressure and force. That system is the only system in our sensory systems that calms the adrenaline response and therefore can make someone feel more comfortable when they are experiencing adrenaline highs from their other senses. So quite naturally, we use proprioception an awful lot in therapeutic settings to help calm people down who are struggling with sensory information. We call it regulating, balancing out that adrenaline response, those sensory responses. And therefore, we can use that when someone's struggling in a more restricted environment, because if we can calm them down overall, that allows us to offer them other opportunities by getting them in a nice calm state first, but it also reduces any dysfunctional behaviour and helps them to cope with things that might be trickier for them at this time. Okay, so we are just going to, when we're looking at sensory issues, therefore, what we're going to do is we're going to swap dysfunctional responses. So if we have somebody who's really struggling with sensory information and they then respond by banging their head against a wall or running out of the room to avoid it, and therefore then pose a risk to themselves because as they run out of that room, they can't manage the risks in the environment outdoors, then we're going to look at what they're getting out of that experience and swap that experience for something else. So if I need more proprioception, I'm going to look for those calming activities that I'm going to take you through in just a little while. And we're going to put more of that in at those times or when they're likely to experience that, so that they then don't go and do something less functional, more dangerous, more difficult or more problematic. We don't want that. We need to give them something on their terms that meets that need, because if we don't, they are going to continue doing what we don't want them to do, or they're going to find their own way, and that may well be less functional than the original one that we were trying to swap it for. Generally, across their day, we want them to experience more calming input, more proprioceptive input, more muscle work, more muscle feedback, more pull, push, force across their whole day. Because the more we introduce that, the less the adrenaline can get through to their brain to create fight or flight responses. So anytime when we want their attention or we want them to engage with us, for example, if somebody needs to create the attention so that they have time to function and eat at a period, we're going to add in more proprioception just before a mealtime to allow them to focus at that mealtime. And then we are going to use those alerting strategies and ideas, which are going to be a little bit later on. I've separated them out so that we can kind of keep it distinct in our minds, to allow them to gain attention if we've got somebody who very easily zones out on us and can't maintain that attention. And we'll cover some of those a little bit later too. Okay. So when we have somebody who presents with struggling because they are oversensitive to information, we are going to use lots of slow, repetitive, calming rhythm-based activities. We're going to use loads of muscle work. Any amount of muscle work we can get them to do, we're going to add it in. And again, I'm going to come up with ideas for those, and we're going to have some pictures to represent those so that they're a bit easier to remember for you, and we're not killing you with too many words on the PowerPoints, because that can always be tricky. We're going to use a lot of strong, predictable routines, and we're going to minimize disruption to routines and make sure that our activities and routines have very definite ends so that they can predict them. And if someone's very oversensitive to sensory information, very reactive, very uncomfortable easily, we're going to, as much as we possibly can, when we want them to engage in something, we're going to remove other things that may make them uncomfortable. So for example, if you want to engage in an activity on the floor, you're going to switch down the TV, you're going to switch down any bright lighting, and perhaps make sure that people don't come and go too much while that activity is going on, to allow that person to focus in on what we want them to focus in on at that time. If somebody tends to be difficult to alert and get their attention off, and they tend to zone out of things easily, we're going to put together some calming activity or seating, along with activities that give a little bit more adrenaline. So we're going to mix together the calming things and the alerting things, because that way we get somebody who gets a bit more adrenaline, but they stay calm at the same time for us, so they stay functional. And that way we can help to keep them there and alerted. But what we're going to do for them is add more stimulation into their environment. But what is consistent between the two things, if you're undersensitive or if you're oversensitive, you need strong, predictable routine with little disruption to your routine and definite ends in activity. It is universal across having sensory issues that predictability and a sense of control is incredibly important. And therefore, if we want our lives to be easier, we need to comply with that to support the people that we live with or support. Okay, so now to the actual activities. Now, the activities are represented by different pictures. Don't take the age of children in the pictures as a guide for who can or can't do something, because that really isn't the case. I am just as likely to be shooting paper plates with a water gun as I am to be doing some workout sessions in a gym, although probably I'm more likely to be using the water pistol against paper plates than doing a workout session in a gym. These are options to try, tools to have in a toolbox, because no one with sensory information takes to all the same things another person. And what works for one person by theory doesn't necessarily work in reality. And what works for you in your house or home or situation where you're supporting somebody won't necessarily work the same as it is in these pictures, but these give you a toolbox of options that mean that you don't have to run out of ideas. Most of these ideas are practical in a home environment right now, or are accessible, because they're what I'm doing with my little girl with sensory needs right now. So we use a lot of target games, and target games are really powerful, particularly for anybody that you have that has a history of throwing things, biting things, kicking things, or banging their head against a wall or any other surface. People who tend to be rougher than they mean to be often respond to target games quite well, because they can use force to direct their muscle system, and that is proprioception. And the majority of these activities that I'm presenting to you as calming have a strong basis in proprioception. They're calming, and therefore they've got a lot of sensation that will reduce that adrenaline reaction. And we'll just have a quick think about how they work as we go, because I want you to imagine when you stand and throw something with force, or if you slam a door really with force, often afterwards you feel quite satisfied and that little bit calmer. And that's what we're trying to create, because proprioception takes you from a feeling of greater anxiety or stress or discomfort from to, and that's what we want to create opportunity for very regularly before sometimes the has had chance to form. So lots of ideas that using everyday utensils and resources at home, washing baskets, cardboard boxes. I often swap where I would have ordinarily, if I was in this kind of an environment, used a ball or gym resources. I will swap those for a pair of socks rolled up like you do when you finished your laundry, because that's a really great soft ball to use in a home environment and can be thrown with significant force without causing any damage. If you can get your hands on a gym ball, so an inflated ball, they're available from most large supermarkets now, which is where I've sourced mine from currently for at home, which means they're still accessible at the moment. We can use those for people to gain quite a significant level of proprioceptive input, and use that to also gain some opportunities to do that little bit of muscle work and gym work to keep that fitness there for them. The people can do that with the gym ball by simply laying on it on their tummy. With support, they may lay backwards over it on their back, but they will need support, and that support generally needs to come around the hips and should only be provided by somebody who doesn't have any health reasons not to do so. It can also be used by sitting and gently bouncing on the gym ball. In some environments, bouncing with greater force can be achieved, but you've got to be able to manage that risk in your home environment. The great one that I love and certainly works with my young daughter is throwing a gym ball with force. We throw that at a surface that is safe, and by safe I mean with no ornaments or precious things close by, no windows, preferably on the outside if we can achieve it. And by throwing it with force against a surface, we are getting maximum physical input to that throwing experience. It also allows people who may not have the motor skill and coordination ordinarily to throw and catch a ball to practice catching and throwing effectively. But it means that they get a huge amount of that muscle pressure input that calms them down. Another favourite of ours in our house is den building. Now, whilst an awful lot of calming activities or regulating activities for somebody with sensory issues can be quite isolating, what we're looking for is opportunities where we can engage with those people, because certainly at the moment, a protracted experience of being in a home environment means that those natural opportunities for interaction haven't been as easily accessible. And therefore, it's more important we take every opportunity that we can to engage in shared activity. Shared activity for many people with sensory issues is going to mean doing things on their terms that mean something to them. And therefore, doing something that meets a sensory need is often a way in to do that. And so me and my daughter spend an awful lot of time building dens, usually at her nagging me, "Mum, can we please build something?" It's always out of my furniture, cushions or cardboard boxes, and usually ends in a sense of an achievement that we've created something together, but we've created a small enclosed environment that reduces sensory stimulus, that provides her a feeling of control, and also provides a sense of proprioception, some force back through her body because she's surrounded by things that kind of press back against her and give her a sense of safety. Many people who struggle with sensory issues calm when they're in very small spaces for just that same reason. So finding a space that they can find as their safe spot where they can really enclose their body in it can make a huge difference and allow them to cope much better throughout the day. and certainly sometimes can be hard to understand. I know I didn't understand it initially when my daughter did it, but it provides a great opportunity to calm and reset to then be able to cope with other sensory information when they return back to us. And where we can, providing any kind of feedback that encloses a person, where they can feel that information back through their body is proprioceptive. It is that pressure back through their body scheme and their muscles. And that means that things like cushions, as simple as a cushion under their feet or a cushion under their bottom. And the example of that I would kind of use to explain it is when you sit down on your sofa of an evening and cuddle right in, you relax far more, you calm far more than when you're trying to sit on that desk chair or dining room chair during the day. And the reason is the same, that you're getting more body feedback that doesn't depend on your body being able to use it effectively. And you can calm and relax into that. Okay, so one thing's for sure in our house, the different ideas for attempting to help my daughter to manage. Right now, because of the way things have been with shopping, we have a number of clothes of hers that don't fit her very well, that are just too tight. And those clothes, unless they stop airflow or blood flow, which I really hope none of us would do to our children or the people that we're supporting or looking after or caring for, those clothes are thermal-based clothes, or indeed a swimming costume, or your water-resistant clothes can often give you extra feedback that forms pressure around your body. Now, other clothes are based in your touch system, which produces adrenaline. It gives you more adrenaline from the light touch. But anything that provides pressure reduces that adrenaline effect and calms us down. So one way to deal with a day that might pose some difficulty, or where someone has struggled in days previously and we really want to help them cope better, then sometimes getting clothes that are that little bit tighter can just bring them down enough to be able to cope. It can also help when they need to engage in an activity that may be more tricky for them, or where clothes are actually really tricky for them. For my girl who will eat happily all day long, isn't particularly doesn't struggle with particular foods, but she does tend to overeat and overfill her mouth a little bit, and she responds really well to an increased opportunity for chewy and crunchy snacks. And that gives her chance to use the muscle pressure around her jaw and her mouth to calm her down naturally. And for some children and people, that will work better than for others. If I'm going to struggle with food, that isn't going to be something that works, but for some people, it's ideal. Now, we have the use of heavy beat music for some people. Heavy beat music offers the chance for increased vibration and experience of vibration, which can be calming for some people. What I would suggest is that if somebody is going to have access to music, you create an option of different types of music for them to choose for themselves what will be calming for them, and watch very carefully how they respond as they're listening to that music to work out what choices you might offer them next time when we're trying to calm them. And therefore the use of earphones with music can really help too, in that not everybody has to share that same music, but they can still calm. It means that they can be in an environment, say for example, with the rest of the family, but not have to cope with all of the noise of the rest of the family. And that's fairly easy to access too. My daughter responds really well to relaxing music and meditation as well as mindfulness. But again, that depends on the individual, but certainly for her preparation for bed and bringing that adrenaline response down, ready for bedtime, those two things help tremendously with getting her in that neurological state for sleep. Now, I put rowing machines on here, not because everybody has a rowing machine in their house, but because I made the wonderful finding that we can get some basic model rowing machines for adults and for teenagers and pre-teens at a cost of around £40. They're in shops that are currently open. I personally found some in Tesco and the Range and other places. I'm not advocating one place or over the other. However, rowing machines are a way to introduce muscle work in what feels like for many teenagers a more age appropriate way. If you're restricted to your home environment but have a space where you can keep a small rowing machine, then it gives opportunity for them to gain that input. And the thing about rowing machines is they don't depend on a high level of balance, coordination and motor skill to be able to operate them, but they can in fact enhance motor skill in using them. They use an awful lot of muscle force, and the rhythm that you use them by means that it can be incredibly calming from a proprioceptive point of view. And for our littler people, and I only say for our little people because our bigger people are likely to resist it like the plague, pegging washing out is a useful activity for lots of muscle force and engagement with a parent or carer whilst they're doing that. It involves lots of muscle work and body awareness too. The only time that that would be a no-go for some of our younger children is where they really, really struggle with fine motor skill using their hand for more sophisticated movement. If they've got a reasonable level of fine motor skill, actually it would be really beneficial to them doing that too. Okay, a great favourite in my house, and you will hate me for saying this, and I do apologise, is my daughter on my oldest sofa, and she literally it disarms the sofa of all of its cushions and they go all over the floor, and literally it becomes an assault course, and we jump and we climb and we move because with the lack of other exercise-based opportunities, this is one way that I can get her to get that movement out and get lots of muscle force in without damaging anything. And so long as you're not precious about that piece of furniture, and be aware that even if you moved on and got a new piece of furniture, then they then think it's okay to do it. So you need to keep that in mind. It is one option for adding in proprioception that has an option to calm people down. Another great one that I really love is using large duvet covers. Now, never, never, never leave anyone unsupervised in a duvet cover, because if they get stuck, they're going to panic, and that's going to cause no end of problems, and we don't want anyone getting themselves really stuck and causing any significant issues. But that offers an environment where, again, you can close down the sensory information around you and get that feedback back through without having to have anything specialist there. It also means that for a lot of my preteen and teen children who come to see me, it gives them a way sometimes of being able to tolerate being amongst the family, but being able to shut down some of that information. And if they're in a duvet cover and they really can't cope, they just don't have to respond to the other people around them, whereas they can't necessarily manage to cope with that environment without some kind of protection and sense of control from it. So it means that they get increased opportunity for interaction, which is incredibly important, because if they've kind of got into the routine of sitting on their own in their room with little opportunity to go elsewhere and a kind of reluctance to go elsewhere because of their sensory needs and other issues, then that's a really good opportunity for them to be able to engage more effectively. It can feel a little unusual at first, but it is a very useful tool for some people. If we can encourage people to do press-ups and commando crawling, that's a really good way to get lots of force back through our body. And essentially what we're doing there is increasing the force back through all four limbs at once. So when we walk, we only get pressure through our legs. What we want to do is use all four limbs to use the muscles to maximum effect to get the most proprioception and therefore the most calming. It's always also another age-appropriate tool that can be really useful. Climbing, if you're happy and feel comfortable with the risk, opportunities to climb in any environment are a really good opportunity to introduce proprioception and calming. That also means that we practice motor skills. It also means that we get some of that movement in there. But it is a very good developmental opportunity. However, we do need to be aware of risk, and you need to manage that in your own environment. Where perhaps we can't do that, or alternatively where there's more opportunity, excuse me, digging in a garden is an incredible way, and any form of gardening offers opportunity for self-esteem building, for activity, for engagement with other people in a very non-threatening way, that a person can feel in control of both the interaction and the sensations that they experience. Digging is great because it often uses a tool that means that you don't have to get your hands into the dirt too. But it's a very powerful way to get lots of muscle work back through. Trampolining is great if you've got that opportunity there already, but I'm not suggesting everybody goes out and buys a trampoline, and you need to be cautious with trampolining that children don't get themselves too heightened with it also. They may need another proprioceptive calming opportunity after trampolining to help bring them down. However, the two things together has a maximum input for them on making that calming effect last, because it's really powerful, forceful input for them. We always encourage the use of yoga positions for teenagers or young children, because again, that uses a really considered muscle work and body awareness. And if you're like my little girl, who has just turned 8 and has taken to the wonderful art of moving her bedroom furniture around recurrently, because she finds it calming and it gives her a sense of achievement. We have to be really careful that she doesn't take on anything too much, but it's the same thing I used to do when I was growing up, and it provides huge amounts of calming, proprioception, and a large amount of control. Where we can and where we can encourage it or persuade, getting children to carry shopping from the car, from anywhere that it's safe for them to be, in multiple trips. Carrying heavy things creates muscle work and calms people down. Anything that offers core strength work is great for building that proprioceptive awareness, that calming opportunity, and we want to encourage it. Where we can, if we're going to get people to move around more, walking, running, moving around, we're going to introduce more weight to them by getting them to carry something heavy, and a backpack is a really good way to do it, because you create force through a really heavily muscled area of body, through the shoulders, and that can be calming. Because if you try it now and just press down on your shoulders, that just takes that sense of stress, that little bit of anxiety that's appeared during the day, and helps you to calm and relax again. And that's what we want to create for children with sensory issues, because ultimately sensory issues result in a high level of adrenaline that is experienced as a pseudo anxiety, and therefore we're trying to create opportunities of calmness and feeling better. A great one for me is tug of war, but I say that with a proviso because many of our children with sensory issues will have balance and coordination issues. And therefore I don't recommend tug of war in standing. I very much recommend tug of war in sitting. I would often encourage Bridget for somebody with sensory issues with a more experienced player partner or an adult, so that it doesn't become too excitable, too screechy, which can then create more adrenaline in other ways. We're going to look at enclosed areas again, and that can be as simple as a beanbag or wrapping in blankets or a cardboard box, which is a favourite of my daughter, who likes to cut them up and make all kinds of weird and wonderful things with them. But they also create a safe space for her without me having to invest in hugely expensive dark dens and other things. And she also gets a sense of that's hers. She gets the achievement of creating and playing and sharing with other people. Crawling activities and games is calming because, again, you're getting feedback through all 4 limbs. It's also an incredibly important developmental activity that many of our children or adults with sensory issues have missed part of it out, and therefore it's valuable for them to do even without the proprioceptive input. And rolling games just the same. You're getting lots of pressure back through the body. You're getting to feel the whole body as you roll across the floor. Just be mindful of risks in rolling games, because many of our of people with sensory issues will be less aware of their own body scheme and risks to that in their environment. So just keep an eye on that for them. And again, I'm sat here with a nice bit of Play-Doh as I manipulate it to keep myself calm, and that force I press through with my hands is creating proprioception that allows me to maintain my concentration on giving you the information I really want you to have today. And that's the same for many of our children or adults with sensory issues. We're just looking for the opportunities that work for them. If I can't move around and I don't have other opportunities, I will use something like Play-Doh, something to press and squeeze and push that allow me to get some of that muscle work in and allow me to keep that adrenaline down. Equally, just like eating crunchy or chewy snacks, drinking from a sports bottle that requires you to suck and use the muscles around your mouth to suck from creates proprioception, calming influence through the muscles of your mouth. And that can break up regularly during the day without anybody knowing that it's got anything to do with any sensory issues. Walking a dog, jumping, stomping, throwing and marching are all ways to get lots of heavy pressure back through for people. And so if I am stuck in a queue, whether I'm social distancing or not, I can march on the spot, I can jump on the spot, I can stomp on the spot. And that allows me to get some of that input in without having to go anywhere particularly. And equally, at the end of the day, or at an end of a particularly tricky period, foot massages, hand massages can be really useful for some people, but other people will find them so difficult to cope with. And you've just got to judge that and wait for somebody to give you an indication that that's okay, or ask you to do it. Or offer it. If it's refused, just back away. Don't force it. Okay. Drinking thick fluid through a straw creates an awful lot of pressure back through your mouth, which again can be calming. And when I say thick fluid, I'm thinking of the thickness of kind of a McDonald's milkshake and the pressure that that creates. Now, luckily, McDonald's is open. I'm not sure if all the milkshake machines are working, but otherwise, just using healthy options at home to create different textures and thicknesses of drink. And using a straw to drink that through can achieve exactly the same thing. Some children won't like it, but many love it. The opportunity to clean your windows, which may then need cleaning again, but the pressure and force and movement of having to clean a window at the height that's safe for them can really offer opportunity for calming input and engagement, because who doesn't find that fun at the beginning? If you've really got to do it for sure, it becomes far less fun. But certainly for children, as an activity, it gives you another tool in your toolbox. And just like we talked about vibrating cushions earlier, electric toothbrushes, when they're used not to clean your teeth, but as part of your routine of your day, doesn't necessarily have to have toothpaste on, but can take the taste part out of it. But the vibration that you get in through an electric toothbrush can provide a calming element also. Some people have access to body socks. They can be ordered online. Body socks are basically just like a big pillowcase that's stretchy. And if you get the right size, when you get in it, just like the little girl on the screen, as you push through it, you get some force back through, some pressure resistance back through, which gives you that force back through. And again, it's similar to the duvet cover in the opportunities it offers, particularly because body socks, generally, because of the material they're made with, you can see through them. So actually you can watch TV through a body sock, so you can be in the room engaging in what's going on without having to be overwhelmed by the other sensory stimulus in the room. But if you don't have a body sock, duvet cover is an option. And blowing bubbles is another way to work the muscles of those mouths, but also offers calming sensory input through proprioception. So there's been lots of calming strategies. Don't worry too much by this slide. It looks a little bit complicated, and it really, really isn't. I want to touch on, before we get right to the end today, on what are the things we can do when someone that we live with or work with or care for really struggles with sensory information, when they have a reaction that is extreme for them in whatever way that comes. For some, that will be in aggressive and violent responses. For some, that will be in hugely emotional responses. For others, it will be in verbally aggressive ways. In others, it will be in complete shutdown. But what I really want to do is just explain to you what's happening, because explaining to you what's happening can really help with you working out what's the best thing to do, both for your own well-being, which is really important, because if we can't maintain your well-being, it's really hard for us to support the well-being of anybody with sensory issues. But also to make sure that that recovery from something significant happening from a sensory point of view as quickly as possible. So if you look at this slide, which is basically like a graph, and it actually reminds me of many of the graphs we've seen over the last few months, but absolutely nothing to do with the COVID situation. This is what happens in our body when we get stimulus in. If I have a significant stimulus that I find difficult, so for example, if I hear nails down a blackboard and I get that real reaction, if that makes me feel physically unwell, or I go to step out in front of a road and a car rushes by and I realise that I've been really close to hurting myself and I get that sudden rush feeling in my body. Essentially, that's what that stimulus reaction creates in somebody who's having a sensory reaction. But please remember, we might not be able to see that, because we might not be able to understand what's caused that stimulus, because it may be so inconsequential to us, we may be completely unaware of it. So for example, some people that I've worked with before have reacted with a really strong fight or flight reaction to a plane coming out of Tees Valley Airport when they're living in North Durham. And therefore, that the people surrounding that person have absolutely no inkling that that stimulus has caused such a severe reaction, but nor does that person either. They can't necessarily tell you what has caused that reaction. They may not be aware at all. All they know is suddenly they feel scared for their life and threatened. And therefore that stimulus happens. And as you see that graph go up, what you see is the increase in adrenaline as it happens, up into what peaks into a strong response. Now, when we see that, that response doesn't always happen at the same time as stimulus. It may take a little bit of time to kick in. But what I want you to know is in doing this, the whole experience of an incredibly strong fight or flight reaction occurs because that adrenaline stays in the body for up to 2.25 hours, and therefore their reactions are impaired and changed for 2.25 hours. Now, if you're anything like me and you've ever experienced a fight or flight reaction, particularly if it's being surrounded by maybe an argument with somebody that you care about, then you know that if you're in the middle of a fight or flight reaction. So for example, I've just walked away from my husband after I've told him he's wrong because he didn't make me a cup of tea on a morning. And I storm off. If he follows me when my adrenaline's high and he tries to talk to me, I will come back at him and argue some more and tell him how wrong he is and be really strong in that argument back. If I'm left alone and that adrenaline leaves my body, I calm, I slow, I get my thought process back, which means that slowly, when I see my husband after 2.5 hours, I'm happy to go, do you know what, I really blew that out of proportion, didn't I? And I'm okay. And the same thing happens for people with sensory issues. By allowing them to go through that full reaction, deal with it in a calm way, in a way that feels safe, we can allow them to give us the best chance of helping them through the other side of it as quickly as possible. Because if you ignite that adrenaline reaction again before the end of that 2.25 hours, you get a bit even bigger reaction that lasts even longer. And we don't want that to happen. So what I'm going to do is explain to you what I would do, what we might see during that. Now, when the stimulus happens, we might not see anything at all. But in reaction to that stimulus, in that first bit, you might start to see that person fidget or move more. It very much depends on how they present from a sensory point of view anyway. But their pupils are likely to dilate. They're likely to become less tolerant of others or other stimulation. They might increase how much they use their voice or vocalization, or that might decrease, or they might have reduced eye contact. And as that adrenaline kicks in more, they may then begin to throw, kick, bite, nip. You will see their breath rate increase. They may sweat more, and many people change the way that they smell because of that fight or flight reaction. It produces a very distinct smell in some people. They may run away, or they may indeed self-harm in some way. And then as that starts to wear down and they come through the other side of that curve, the escalation decreases. They start to slow in reactions. They start to close down their personal space often, and they may start to seek out comfort. And as that starts to come back to a point of function again, they may begin to seek other people out. They may start to attempt eye contact again, depending on their eye contact, their comfort with eye contact in the first place. They may become more tired, and they may try and access some kind of motivating activity for them. During this, what should you do? Well, certainly, right up until that last stage, that recuperation stage, what you need to do is remove verbal interaction. You need to stay present or close by so that they don't feel abandoned, but equally, you need to be safe too. And you don't want to be up in their face. They need to be able to remove themselves from you. Remove eye contact. Allow them to seek refuge. Provide lots of safe, calming opportunities. So think back to those examples I've used and think about which ones you may be able to use that will be available, but you don't have to interact with them to offer them. And then what we're going to do is we're going to wait for signs that that last stage is there, that recuperation is there. We're going to look for a glance from them, a move of a limb towards you, a word, a head movement towards you, or a slight move of position towards you. And what I would do then is copy that movement and wait for them to do something else so that they know I'm waiting for them, so that they know I'm responsive to them, so that they know I am not going to do anything threatening that's going to make them feel scared again. Wherever you possibly can, let them approach you. Don't address the issue that started the response that you saw. So if they were banging their heads, don't ask them why they were banging their heads. If they hurt somebody else, don't mention that they hurt anybody else at this point. Don't discuss those difficulties for up to 2 hours. Don't let them experience anything challenging for up to 2 hours. But when I'm talking about this particular scenario, I'm talking about those scenarios that are really quite extreme as opposed to little blips. And in doing this, you will maintain their safety, you will maintain your safety, you will maintain their well-being and yours. And it may just help you to deal with some of those trickier scenarios. So when we're talking about alerting strategies, we're going to use alerting strategies, certainly not when somebody is hyper, showing us any edginess. We're not going to use alerting strategies when somebody has just gone through a big adrenaline response. You know, a lot of the things that many people think of as sensory are often these alerting things. And when I say alerting, what I mean is these are things that produce adrenaline, therefore increase your heightenedness, increase your awareness and how much you might want to move and how much you want to engage. So if you have a fast thinking child who never stops, these are the things that you want to cushion between 2 bits of proprioception, 2 bits of calming activity either side of this, or some calming activity during it. So we might do movement breaks, but we're going to do movement breaks while carrying something heavily. We might do messy play, water play, but we're going to do it whilst we're sat on a move and sit cushion, or an inflated cushion, or a cushion that has a little bit of vibration, or a gym ball, or we're going to get them to roll on the floor before they do it. The things that are alerting are things that allow us to move, and we all know that movement things are alerting. We know because that vestibular system is quite heightening. Every time I work with young children, and if I'm losing their concentration, like I'm probably losing your concentration right now because I've been talking for such a long time, then we're going to get them to move around. Things like Play-Doh, not only does it offer pressure, but it offers touch experience, and therefore, when it's used in touch, can alert people. Fidget toys are alerting, rapid movement, quick movement, circular movement is alerting. Drinking cold water is alerting. And where you're stuck and you want to wake someone up, a good old jumping jack can come in and do the trick quite nicely. So The other thing that's important, and after I've kind of got through this slide and we've got some information, I'm just going to check through and see what questions we have so that I can make sure I've answered any questions before we stop. But be mindful for anybody with sensory issues, for anybody with a social communication issue or a neurodevelopmental issue, repetitive, regular routine is essential. It's not a nice to have. Being able to predict what's going to happen to you makes a huge difference between achieving well-being and just surviving. Using visuals to support understanding and memory of routine and structure can really help. Using simple and minimal language and communication can make a huge difference. And I often say, it sounds awful, but I often use the strategy to help myself remember to say, remember to talk to my daughter as if I'm talking to the dog when I really need her to do something. Because if I add in too much language, she loses the point of what I'm trying to say. My daughter's very able in many ways, but she does struggle with attention and concentration sometimes. And so if I use the command Imogen, door now, Imogen, car now, I know that she can grasp that and I don't get her lost in the language. If I give her the example of, Imogen, darling, when you come downstairs, would you mind waiting by the door for me because I'm just about ready to go? I've lost her in that conversation and she's more likely to get lost in the command. Always say things in the order that they're going to happen because that makes it much easier to interpret and keep in your mind. Always use a child's name first if you need their attention. And try your very best, although it's very hard to do, to tell a child what to do, not what not to do. Because they'll hear the not what to do and think you're telling them what to do. And that's all they'll have going through their head. And hopefully that will help you survive this prolonged period of more intense interaction for family and closed environments and less access to opportunities for sensory engagement. I've got some ideas for resources there that a lot of people find useful, so please take a look at those. They're all resources that other parents have said to me have been really useful to you. So if you find anything else that you want to pass on, or that you find any of those useful or not useful, please do let me know. So really, I just want to double check in to see whether anybody has any questions, because we've talked about very, very briefly what sensory issues are, the importance of that proprioception, which is calming and is about pull, push, pressure and force. And we've used examples of those calming activities to help you to look at what you can offer right now that might help you to manage. And we've talked about strategies for managing sensory need, particularly at times of crisis and challenging responses. So let me just double check through and have a look to see what questions we've got here. Okay, we've just had a question just about TAC-PAC in sensory sessions. That follows a slightly different, just for information, it follows a slightly different mode of thinking. If anybody's not heard of TAC-PAC, what that uses is lots of tactile input in different ways, often uses brushing techniques as well, that allows us to input sensory information, but it's based on flooding the body with lots of tactile information rather than reducing discomfort through the use of the proprioceptive system. That sounds really technical, doesn't it? And makes them far more complicated. What you're doing with that is creating the adrenaline so that, like you or I, if we go to something and we are flooded with adrenaline throughout the day, there comes a point when we don't even detect that the adrenaline's increased because we're already flooded with adrenaline. And what TAC-PAC does is increase your adrenaline level so that you then don't feel other adrenaline causing sensations. And actually, my personal finding kind of clinically is that I have more result using the proprioceptive stuff than TAC-PAC, but I'm happy to go through that at a different session when we've got a little bit more time to do that and talk about the pros and cons of that in more detail. The slides, I believe, will be available generally, and the session's being recorded so that people can continue to access it. I have another question, which is, well, what can we do to get children to wear clothes or at least tolerate them? It's a really tricky one, particularly in lockdown because there's less necessity to wear clothes. often if children have got into the habit of not wearing clothes, because we know that children who struggle with clothing often experience the tactile, the touch input of clothing as genuine pain. Some have described it as like having razor blades against the skin. And the best example that I can give you to help kind of give you an idea of how that feels is if you don't tolerate woolly jumpers and you're given kind of a turtleneck woolly jumper to wear, and by the end of the day you want to kind of pull it off you, that's how often children feel when we put clothes on them. So for them to be able to cope through the rest of the day, being constantly able to tolerate that can be really tricky. What we often do is provide control, so let them wear what they need to wear within reason. So for my daughter, what I'll do is try and replicate her pyjamas in clothes that are actually clothes, so that she's happier to accept those. The other thing that I will do is put on more proprioception for her to do before we try and dress her, and give her regular proprioception throughout the day. I'll also give her times when she can actually take her clothes off for a while and we'll start again. But it is a tricky one to do in just one go, because often when a child's suffering that much, there's a lot more sensory going on there. So for now, I would really concentrate on the overriding things that I've talked about today, of lots of proprioception that will reduce that adrenaline generally and make overall her ability to be able to cope with clothes and other sensory experiences better. If I've got a question here, what do I do if my child does not want to come out of a safe space? If it's not causing a risk and it's not causing a problem, don't force it. And then I would look for the biggest motivators I could possibly find for that child, so that eventually they will come out. I don't fight battles with my own daughter, who has a lot of these needs. I don't fight battles that I don't need to have. But where I can, if I can do it through positive reinforcement, that will always increase the trust in my relationship with her. And so what I do then is say, I have got, or for my little girl, I've got the water tray outside, do you want to come out? And eventually she'll come out of the safe space into the water tray, because it's one of her favourite things to do, and whatever that takes. But if it's not causing me a problem, I don't worry about it at all. If it's not causing her a problem, don't worry about it at all. I may offer stimulation in there, and often if I offer some things in there, eventually they'll come out and want to try and share it with me. But it depends on the child and what things you've got that they'll be motivated by. So you're looking for the things that they're motivated by and using those at those points, but never insist, never force, unless it's a dangerous situation where it absolutely has to happen. Right, somebody's asked me that whether they should try out weighted support without a formal assessment. If my advice on that is, if your child doesn't have any health conditions, any musculoskeletal conditions, as a parent, you can make the call to try out weighted items within reason. We tend to say stick to 20% of the child's weight to make it safe for younger children, because obviously they have growth plates. We don't want to cause any problems with growth or damage any joint systems. But technically, weight shouldn't cause any problem any more than getting them to carry their school bag with things in, or other examples of that, or climbing or playing. So if you're doing it within reason, there shouldn't be a reason for not to do that. Often you will hear qualified therapists talk about not recommended weighted blankets. The reason for that is that there have been cases internationally where people have experienced death through use of a weighted blanket, and therefore we tend not to recommend them. The use of those things was in specific, when those deaths happened, that happened in specific circumstances, so we tend not to recommend those. But you can use weight and experience of proprioception in lots of different ways, and it doesn't just have to be through weighted items. And actually we know the power of proprioception increases when it is active proprioception, so where a child is using their muscles rather than a weight just being applied to them. So it may be worth you trying some more of the things we've suggested today to see if they offer you an alternative first. Thank you to the person that said sorry they've got to go, and thank you very much. But from me, I have absolutely thoroughly enjoyed talking with you all today. It's a shame that I can't get as much feedback as I would like from you, but I've absolutely enjoyed it, and hopefully you found it useful. Thank you so much for attending with me. Bye-bye.